The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is the Byte Show. And we're really blessed to have Joseph P. Farrell with us. Dr. Farrell can be reached at this email address, Vardas, VARDAS, the number 3, at AOL.com. And visit his website, GizaDeathStar.com. And there is a PayPal button there. Please use it. We've got to keep him in research material, and I think he needs new glasses. Don't you, Joseph?
Oh, I need a lot of things, George.
Well,
thank you.
I know you've mentioned glasses.
Well, yeah, it's partly my fault because I've just postponed. You know, I finish one book and then I get started right with the next one, and just I haven't stopped to make time to make the appointment. But yeah, you're right. I do, and I appreciate that, GeorgeAnn. Thank you.
You're welcome, dear.
I want to thank everybody that has been that have become members and made donations, and I also want to thank people for sending me articles. This is something that has kind of started in maybe the last 2 or 3 months. People are starting to send me articles that they think might interest me, and now my email box is full every day with people. Well, it literally is, with people sending articles and things that they think might interest me. So it takes a lot of time to go through all those, but it's also kind of helpful because it lets me know, what people are thinking and what they're interested in. So, and it helps me a lot too in some ways. Sometimes, I get behind on research for the website and doing the books, and I've got a ready pool of articles in my emails I can look at. So I wanted to thank people for that. But anyway, thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, we've got this little machine up on Mars.
Yes.
What do they actually hope to find?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I've actually got a blog coming up, I think toward the tail end of next week, some rather interesting photos that I found skimming through NASA's website that were taken shortly after that thing landed there. And just some things in these photos kind of caught my eye as being a bit odd. I'm not going to go and say that they're artificial, but I'm certainly entertaining the possibility because they just look odd.
Like what?
Well, you find, the giveaway feature for artificiality is geometric or regularity. In other words, rectilinearity and symmetry and things of this sort. And where it landed, it's got some pictures. It took me about 3 hours of looking at all sorts of pictures that NASA had already put up on the website, and I found a few and posted them in this blog. But I think, in short, what they're looking for, if you buy the public statements of NASA, I think, in short, they're looking for indications or signs that Mars could sustain life and that it may have at one time in its history done so, and I happen to think that's probably true. In fact, I think there's beginning to be now a consensus amongst most planetary geologists that have studied the question that Mars probably did at one time have some sort of life. Now, obviously, in my opinion, I think that it may have been intelligent life. We go way back in the Cosmic War series, and the way it looks to me is that Mars have been at one point part of an interplanetary civilization right here in the solar system. So, I've gone further out on the limb than what I've done tonight thus far. But I think that's in part what they're looking at. That's the public story. Privately and covertly, GeorgeAnn, I really do think that there are those within not only NASA, but within the American version of what we would call a secret space program. In other words, the military version of NASA.
Yeah.
I really do think that there are those within that group of people who already, number one, know that there's something up there.
Yeah.
And number two, that they are sending as many of these probes to Mars as they can, scoping out areas that they have selected based on orbital photography and mapping for these landed robotic probes to prowl around and look for things. This is exactly what I think is going on. They're looking for further confirmation of the existence, in my opinion, of that very ancient civilization, and they're looking for it on Mars because that's where they have determined from their own research, from their own experts telling them that this is what the texts say, this is what they're doing. There's no doubt in my mind. Do I have any proof of that? No, of course not.
Well, the last one they sent up there was crawling around, and its camera lens got dirty.
Yeah, the solar panels got dusty. And
somebody cleaned them off.
I
mean...
Yeah, that episode, that one was reported, and then it kind of disappeared real fast. Well, there's lots of strange stuff going on with Mars. The other thing that convinces me that there is something going on in outer space is, of course, a couple of months ago, the Russians launched their satellite, which was called Phobos Grunt, all right?
Oh, my goodness.
Now, what this satellite was supposed to have done was it was to have rendezvoused with the Martian moon Phobos. Now, that moon of Mars is this little rock that is rather, in one sense, it's rather irregular looking. In other words, it's not a nice round sphere like our...
Looks like a potato.
Yeah, it kind of looks like a potato when you look at it from a distance. And, the Soviets, the Russians launched this probe that was to have journeyed to Mars and then landed on Phobos, all right, and then collected samples and doing all the things that robotic probes do. Now, that in itself right there is a very, very interesting thing because this would have required some very sophisticated technology and capabilities from the Russians because, of course, Phobos won't have much gravity and so on and so forth. So landing a probe on it would be quite a feat, quite an accomplishment. Now, the problem is when the Russians launched this thing, it was launched up into and put into Earth orbit for its ejection into the trajectory on the way to Mars. But once it got up there, something happened, and the probe completely malfunctioned, and, it never even made it out of Earth orbit. Now, the interesting thing is that when that happened, there were certain parties in Russia that were accusing, and again, I want to preface my remarks by saying I have not had time to follow this story to ground. Okay? I'm merely reporting something that was rumored and then almost as quickly died. All right. I haven't been able to verify or falsify this story, but I think it's kind of significant because it leads into a deeper issue that I want to get to.
Okay.
There were voices in Russia that accused the United States of sabotaging their probe. All right.
Boy.
Now, that in itself if it's true that these voices are coming from legitimate, reliable, not kooky or not tinfoil hat fringe crowds in Russia.
Right.
If it's coming from reliable and fairly connected people within the Russian government, that's quite a statement to make. Now, this takes us back to something that I think was going on during the Cold War, when the space race was at its height, and when the Russians were, for the most part, beating us in almost every conceivable way when it came to space matters. There were a number of launch failures in the Soviet Union that were never ever reported, either in the Soviet press or to the West. And of course, a lot of that is because the Soviets did not want to acknowledge or admit, to their public that they were having these colossal failures. In some cases, rockets were simply blowing up right on the launch pad.
Oh my!
But there was back then an interesting, and I forget the source where I read this, but if my memory serves me correctly, it was a fairly reliable source. There was an accusation and an admission that some of these launch failures in the Soviet Union were due to American sabotage. And this, to me, indicates that, if we put all of this together, and if we factor in yet another consideration, and this was NASA's proclamation, for want of a better word, about 2 years ago, that they wanted the Apollo landing sites on the moon to be treated as historic sites, number one, and that there would be a no-fly zone and a no-enter zone around these sites of, I forget what it was, a few hundred yards, maybe it was a couple of kilometers, I don't remember right off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But basically, NASA was telling the rest of the world, hands off our landing sites.
Yeah.
Don't go there.
Yeah.
Okay. Don't fly over them.
Okay.
So, that invites all sorts of speculation. But my point here is that there is something fishy going on in space. And either NASA does not want other people to find out the possibility. You can hear the Apollo hoaxers already saying, well, that's because if they flew over those sites or attempted to visit them, they wouldn't find anything because we never went there.
Yeah.
Well, I've never subscribed to that school. I think the real reason is that, like I've argued all along, that there was some sort of advanced technology involved in the Apollo missions, all right? And that, number one, they don't want that found out. And number two, it is also possible that those landing sites were chosen. This would be the argument of Richard Hoagland and some other people, that those sites were deliberately chosen because their probes had suggested that there were anomalous features to be found there and possibly artificial things, possibly. So I think maybe that's the second reason, but it's mighty peculiar when you factor in all these considerations. Number one, sabotage.
Yeah.
And that was probably going on between, both Russia and the United States at the time.
Yes.
All right. And number two, then you have, the thesis I presented in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, where you have this staggered schedule of launches of robotic probes to the moon between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviets would launch a couple probes, and then they'd sit back and do nothing, and let us launch a couple of probes, and then we'd sit back and do nothing, and then the Russians would launch. It looks as if the whole schedule between Russia and the United States was less a race and more coordination.
Yeah.
So that's another factor that's very, very strange. Then you've got these probes that the Russians keep sending to Mars that keep failing for some reason. I mean, the Russian track record, GeorgeAnn, with Mars is horrible.
Well, they have good scientists.
Well, of course they do.
And there's no reason for them to fail except sabotage.
Well, this, it is peculiar. And I'm thinking, that there is, and, I'm doing this book right now on this whole subject. I'm thinking that there is some sort of covert war going on in space between various groups here on Earth, and note that I use the word group rather than nations.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The European program, the Russian program, the American program, Chinese, Japanese, Brazil, India, all of these nations that have these programs. I really think that these programs are being fronted by nations, but that the real powers behind them are various oligarchies and elites that are trying to explore, and they're shooting at each other. They're trying to stake the claim to space. It's like we're watching the race of Europe for the New World. We've got Spain, Portugal, France, England, Holland. So it's kind of a similar situation, and there's going to be little conflicts along the way, and that's part of what's going on. The other part of what's going on, I have to entertain the suspicion that, or the possibility, that there's some other player on the block, too.
Yeah.
And not necessarily anyone we know about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Now that may not necessarily mean extraterrestrials. It could be people living on the bottom of the ocean, for all we know.
Yeah.
But there is something very peculiar, mightily peculiar, going on in space, and it's pointed out by these strange oddities. Russia has successfully landed probes on Venus, which is much, much more difficult than anything that you can imagine trying to land on Mars.
Yeah.
Well,
there must be, then, Joseph, there must be something on Mars that we don't want the Russians to see.
Well, I think you can make that argument not only about Mars, but about the moon.
Oh, yes.
But the other problem is, you see, you've got, and again, it's very difficult to make sense out of these scenarios because you've got so many weird things going on. You do have NASA now publicly publishing strange photos, from Iapetus, the moon of Saturn, to these photographs that I'm blogging about in a week or so that Curiosity sent back.
Yeah.
NASA's now doing these things, and from what I can tell, at least thus far, it's not necessarily trying to airbrush things out of the photos. They're just there.
Yeah.
And from what I can tell, they're not deliberately inserting things into photos. They're just there. So you've got that going on. So I don't know what all this portends. I can boil it down and say that, number one, they're looking for something. Number two, there's a group of people here on Earth that probably know what they're looking for and have probably found some of it, and they're not talking. And there are peculiar failures of space technologies and systems of other nations. Again, I go back to this Phobos Grunt satellite that the Russians tried to launch to Mars. The Russians are not technologically incompetent.
Right.
This is the major problem here.
Right.
So if my thesis is true, and if your thesis is true, that this is largely America trying to prevent everybody else from going or finding something else, then there's an easy prediction to be made to find out if that thesis holds true. Mm-hmm. And that prediction would be, do other space programs that have launched probes to Mars have a statistically unusual rate of failure of those probes. That would be the way to see whether or not that thesis is legitimate. Now, to a certain extent, it's already been answered because, once again, Russia has had an unusually high number of its probes that it has tried to send to Mars fail.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the famous Phobos 2 mission that they tried to send to Mars. That's the one that took those very, very strange pictures of what is clearly a large artificial object that was, who knows, was it in orbit around Mars? Was it just there at the moment? We don't know, but it's clearly artificial. It looks like a long kind of rod or pencil way off in the distance. You know, it's got sharp edges. It's clearly metallic.
Wow.
It's clearly artificial. And, you know, Phobos took this picture, and then bang, no more Phobos. You never heard from it again. And the rumor has it that the Soviets were so stunned by the pictures that Phobos 2 took before it failed that they secretly shared the photos at a very secret level with the United States. And probably what they were, and I think probably that's true. They probably did. And they probably said, "Hey, is this yours?" You know, and when we said no, is it yours? And they said no. Then, you know, that leaves the question, well, whose is it? You know, because at that time nobody else has a space program, at least not that we know of.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, you know, this is a rather big thing that occurred. You know, I put those pictures in The Cosmic War. It's a rather famous episode.
Yeah.
You know, and if it's genuine, and I happen to think it is, then yeah, you know, the idea of photographing something clearly artificial and then you lose your probe.
Yeah.
That's, you know, there's a causal relationship most likely between the two events. So you can't blame the Soviets for sharing them secretly with the United States and making inquiries.
Right.
And, you know, in all likelihood, again, you can't leap to the conclusion that this was something extraterrestrial. It just simply means it's an unknown. So does that unknown indicate an extraterrestrial presence there on Mars, or does it indicate that somebody else here on Earth has some sort of secret program going that nobody else knows about? I lean towards the latter.
Well, how could they not know about it? With these satellites that photograph everything going on Earth, they would surely photograph a launch.
Well, the problem here is that let's go back to the issue raised by Roswell and by my interpretation of it, which of course is that no, this wasn't anything extraterrestrial at all.
I agree.
It was probably something human, and it was probably something Nazi, because that's what the Air Force intelligence documents that I put in the book basically boil down to.
Yeah.
All right? Now, back in 1947, you have three things that the American military, if it came to that conclusion, would have had to contend with. Number one, the first implication is, all right, there's Nazis out there somewhere. They're still doing this stuff.
Yeah.
And we don't know exactly where they're doing it. But, number two, the military would have known, it was common knowledge within American intelligence, that many of these Nazis went to South America. So if there's any likely place for them to be doing this sort of stuff, it would be there. So if we go back to that, number three then is they didn't have the satellite technology back then to surveil the entire surface of the Earth. They were just getting started with that idea because of the imminent possibility that the Soviet Union was going to detonate an atomic bomb and become a nuclear power, and number two, they knew that the Soviets were working on rockets too, and the big fear in the American military at that juncture was that atomic bombs could be wedded to ballistic missiles, and that would pose a strategic threat, and therefore you had to monitor Russia, you had to monitor the Soviet Union, which was definitely a closed society.
Yeah.
And the only way to do that was from the air or from space. So this is where you got the whole impetus within the American military to develop reconnaissance high-altitude aircraft and then ultimately, of course, spy satellites.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with spy satellites is even though the resolution very quickly became fairly good, I think that back in the early 60s, the Corona satellites were still dealing with a resolution, say, of 10 or 15 feet. In other words, if they took a photograph, you couldn't resolve any finer detail than an object smaller than 10 or 15 feet. All right.
Okay.
In other words, the capability back then was not able to read a car license plate number from outer space.
Right.
Now the resolution's much greater.
Yeah.
And the other problem back then was they didn't have enough satellites up there to cover the entire Earth. That was the second problem. So if there is a base here on Earth, then it's more likely that they would have discovered it now than back then. But there's another problem we have to consider, and that is that any technology that we might be dealing with, what are we looking for? If we're looking for rocket launches, that's one thing. You're right. Those would be easily detectable by any country with any sort of spy satellite capability, and anymore, that's a lot of countries. Okay.
Yeah.
But if you're dealing with a different kind of technology, if you're dealing with flying saucers, if you're dealing with UFOs, anti-gravity, then basically the only way you're going to probably detect something like that is through radar. You're going to have to be looking for it, in other words.
Yeah.
And sometimes not even that works because, there's reports of UFOs, of people seeing UFOs. This was a common occurrence during World War II, where both Allied and German pilots would see UFOs and radio back to their headquarters if their radar operators could see anything on their screens.
Yeah.
And very oftentimes the answer was no. And sometimes vice versa. Sometimes it would be visible to the radar operators, but not to the pilots.
So they had cloaking.
Yeah, we don't know what we're dealing with. Are these living creatures? Are these balls of ball lightning? Are these actual technological things? In the case of technology, for the most part, I think UFOs of that nature tend to have both optical and radar signatures. This seems to be the case, at least from what I've read. Probably Richard Dolan would know more about these types of questions. But what are we looking for?
Yeah.
I think, in other words, my point is, by raising all these questions, GeorgeAnn, is even though having a secret space program would be difficult now, nonetheless, it could be done.
Yeah.
All right. It would simply be a matter of, one part of keeping things secret is simply construing a situation where people look at something and then create a context where they interpret it in a certain way. Mm-hmm. There's all sorts of ways to play this out. So, anyway, may we pause for a brief break?
Yes, we're going to pause now.
All right.
Here we go.
Uh-huh.
Okay, we're back, Joseph.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, there's a couple of other things about this idea of secret space program I want to mention. And the first is, if you had the technology, then it wouldn't be very difficult to, and if you had a sufficient financial base. This is a point I want to return to. But if you had a sufficient financial base and a sufficient technology, one of the easiest places to conduct a secret space program would be from the ocean.
Yeah.
Because after all, 2/3 of the Earth is covered in water.
Yes.
And, the oceans are, in another sense, they're the last great unexplored frontier on planet Earth. Because the publicly available technology, we still don't have the capability to go down to the depths of the ocean and explore. I mean, it's so murky and so black.
Yeah.
For one thing, that even having the light or the equipment to be able to do so. But
there's monsters down there.
Well, of course, there's Leviathan and the Great Deep and all of that.
Yeah.
But if you had the technology, you could conceal bases on the ocean floor because our satellites tend to be looking at land.
Yeah.
Not necessarily things coming up from the ocean surface. And there are, of course, numerous reports of unidentified submerged objects, flying into or out of the ocean right in front of people's eyes.
Right.
So, that's clearly a technology that is not publicly available to humans. And, there have been reports of these things dating back for some time in history. So that would indicate, at least to me, that somebody is here and has it.
And has been here for a long time.
And has been here for a while.
Yeah.
So, the other thing that is an indicator of a really secret program, a group that no one really knows about on the surface of the Earth.
Yeah.
Is something that I have not been able to verify to my satisfaction to write about, but I can at least mention because it's a story that gets talked about every now and then in this connection. And that's something called the Black Knight satellite. All right? This is a satellite that supposedly was discovered in the late 50s and early 60s. When scientists began to hear radio chatter that sounded like intelligent signaling.
Yeah.
And according to the story, they were able to trace it to a satellite, a 15-ton satellite.
Oh, my gosh.
In polar orbit
around
the Earth. Now, here's the problem. In the late 50s and early 60s, neither the Soviet Union nor the United States had any launch vehicle that could boost 15 tons into orbit, number one. That's number one. And number two, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union at that time had mastered the technique of placing anything into polar orbit. So in other words, again, if the story is true, and I emphasize if the story is true, here's yet another indicator that somebody is here and has a technology and is independent of the two major powers at that time that did have the technology.
Wow.
Okay, now, who is it? I don't know. The problem of arguing that it's Nazis is that this would require you to believe that from the end of World War II to the late 50s or early 60s, they were able to perfect their technology beyond merely its gateway plateau that they had brought it to during the war and brought it to a practical technology 15 or so years later, which is entirely possible, but you'd have to argue, that they did this with a great deal of financing and so on and so forth, which brings me back to that point. If we're talking about secret space programs of anybody, doesn't matter if it's, NASA or Russian or whatever, if you're going to have such a thing and develop technologies like this, then the way to verify that that might really be going on is it would require a massive amount of funding. And in my opinion, most likely, GeorgeAnn, it would be funding that you would want to keep entirely separate from any sort of public oversight or knowledge.
Oh.
In other words, what I'm saying to you is that if you're going to have a breakaway civilization along the lines that Mr. Dolan proposes, or that I wrote about in Saucer, Swastikas, and Psyops, that it's going to have a virtually independent financial system.
Yeah.
All right. It's going to overlap in a few places with that of the rest of the world, but it's going to be huge. It's going to be virtually entirely off the books.
Yeah.
And do I think such a thing exists? Yes, I do. I really do. And for various reasons that I don't want to get into here. But this is the other telltale clue, in my opinion, that a secret space program would exist.
Wow. Oh, Joseph. Well, one existed before.
Sure.
In the Pseudepigrapha.
Yeah.
The 2-volume set published by Doubleday, edited by Charles Worth.
Right.
In Volume 1. And Joseph, I can't remember if it's in the text or in a footnote.
Uh-huh.
And it has copious footnotes.
Yes, I know.
It says that they departed the earth, parked in the meridian of high noon, and wept as they watched the destruction.
Well, this is why I think you've had, at least since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
You've had people like Jonathan Swift, the English satirist, and so on, strongly indicating that there was, in their thinking, the ability that technology would eventually produce the ability for mankind to go into space.
Yeah.
But simultaneously with that appearance, I think something else happened, and that was that it began slowly to dawn on people that the ancient texts, regardless of what one looked at, Bible, Greek myths, what have you, that they might be texts that were actually talking about a reality that could only be understood as a reality if you granted technological sophistication to the people behind the stories.
Mm-hmm.
That, in other words, implies what we would commonly call Atlantis. I don't like the term. I prefer very ancient high civilization
Yes.
to avoid all the, Atlantis, where is it questions.
Yeah.
Once you begin to entertain those ideas, and it really gets underway with a vengeance, in my opinion, during World War II. Not only with the Nazis, but I think there is a certain quarter within American and British higher-ups within their militaries and intelligence circles that the same sort of thinking goes on with them, and certainly the Russians as well, that, hey, we're looking at the developments of modern physics and we're looking at these ancient texts, and now these texts are beginning to look possible.
Yeah.
All right? So, do I think that this would be a component of the thinking of whoever it is that has a secret space program? You betcha.
Mm-hmm.
Because the other thing that, as I point out in the Cosmic War, that these texts indicate very clearly, if you read them from that point of view, they indicate that, number one, some of that technology that was used to fight that war survived.
Yeah.
Number two, we carted a bunch of it off to make use in other things.
Uh-huh.
Number three, some of it couldn't be destroyed.
Oh.
So we hid it.
Oh, boy.
So, if they hid it and this technology makes all of these wondrous things possible, like blowing up planets.
Oh, dear. Yeah.
All right. Now, what are you going to do if you've reached that conclusion, GeorgeAnn? If you've reached the conclusion this technology really did exist at one time, number two, some of it survived because it could not be destroyed. So number three, it was hidden. And number four, this ancient civilization was interplanetary.
Yeah.
If you have read those texts and come to those four conclusions, which are entirely reasonable,
Yeah.
all right, if you've come to those four conclusions, say, and you are someone high within the Soviet space program,
Yes.
what do you do about your four conclusions? Well,
No.
you go looking for the technology. Why? Because you don't want the Americans to get it first.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they get it first, they're crazy enough to try and use it
Yeah.
to make you, the Soviet Union, do their bidding. Or vice versa. If you're the Americans within the space program and you've come to those four conclusions, what do you do about them? Well, you go looking for the technology.
Yeah.
Because you don't want anybody else to get there first.
Yeah.
So, is this going on in the space race? I think that's part of it. Is this the reason, partly, that you find the West in this mad rush to inject its power into the Middle East and Central Asia? I think that's part of it. I think that's a deeply hidden part of it. Yeah, absolutely I do.
Well, what would the Middle East have to do with the space race?
I just got done saying what it had to do. If there is an ancient civilization,
Yeah.
it had a technology,
Yeah.
it was used to fight a terribly destructive war,
Mm-hmm.
and some of that technology survived the war because it could not be destroyed and was hidden, then where are and the texts that you're reading come from the Middle East,
Yes.
then where is a likely place to look for some of that hidden technology?
Middle East.
Middle East.
Oh.
And does that technology spoken about in those ancient texts have to deal with space?
Oh, yeah.
Sure, of course it does.
Yeah.
So what does it have to do with the space program? There's your answer right there. It's obvious.
Oh, gee, Joseph. That's a stunner.
Well, we've talked about this before. These things going on,
Yeah.
I mean, the irrationality that you see going on, the hysteria that you see going on with some of these people running the world today,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
risking nuclear war.
Yes.
Well, why would rational beings risk such things? Well, part of the answer may be that when you read these texts, you're dealing obviously with things much worse
Yeah.
than atom bombs and hydrogen bombs. Much worse.
Well, another part of that text describes, I think it was a shepherd that was out in the field, and he was putting his sheep away in the fold, and a bad air came, and everyone in the village died. Every sheep, every goat was dead.
Well, Sitchin talks about that, and he interprets that as radioactive fallout, from a very, very ancient nuclear war, which, again, it could be.
Yeah.
It's very, very strange that you do find these indicators that are very, very old of nuclear explosions on the surface of the Earth.
Yes.
I'm not inclined to think that these ancient texts that many interpreters place on them, like the famous text in the Mahabharata and so on, that these are referring to nuclear weapons. Because, again, I think if you read other texts, Mesopotamian texts in particular, they are describing things much more horrific in terms of their destructive power than mere hydrogen bombs.
Yes.
So, if you're a scientist or a general or what have you in the military or intelligence or scientific complexes of the Soviet Union or the United States or Great Britain or Germany or China or what have you, and you're reading these texts and you're reading them in that way, then it stands to reason that no matter how kooky it sounds, you're going to try and find that technology before your competitors do.
Yeah. Oh, boy. Oh my gosh, Joseph.
I think this is I genuinely do. People can call me crazy. They can call me kooky. I think that this is one of the deeply hidden motivations for the contest that we see going on right now in the Middle East. I really, really do. That doesn't mean that the other considerations, geopolitics, oil, and so on and so forth, aren't legitimate. They are. They are absolutely legitimate. But I think at a very deep level, this is what you have going on.
Wow. Gosh. Oh, my gosh.
Let's put the question differently.
Okay.
If there is even only a 10% chance that this reading of ancient texts that I've been advocating in books like The Cosmic War, if there's only a 10% chance that it is true, and you're a member of the general staffs or the scientific advisory boards of your country, do you say, well, it's only 10% true, let's not worry about it?
No.
Of course not. If there's even a slight chance that it's true, you would still worry about it.
Oh, yeah.
You would still try and do something about it.
Wow. Well, is that why there's all these bombs and killing and stuff going on over there?
Well, no, I don't think that's the sole reason. But like I say, it's a deeply hidden and rooted one. As for the most part of the reason, it's just the insanity of the Western oligarchs right now, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, boy. You can underline the word insanity. Oh, yes. Absolutely, Joseph. Oh. Well, the thing about the underwater bases is very, very interesting. I think it was Bill Cooper who was on a Navy ship, and he it's on a video where he talks about seeing this thing come up out of the water.
Well, there are any number of reports of unidentified submerged objects, and there's a really interesting researcher out there by the name of Dr. Richard Sauter.
Yeah, oh yes.
That has written a book, Underground and Underwater Bases and Tunnels and so on. And he has documented, American military studies of the possibility of underwater basing of military assets, including, permanent human residence.
Oh, my gosh.
So this is not anything beyond the pale by any stretch of the imagination. If the military is talking about it, as he documents in the late 50s and 60s, then the possibility probably has already been actualized or realized.
Wow. Good grief, Joseph.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, how would they get food? Would it be something akin to the movie, The 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea?
Sure, they could, hydroponics. There's any number of ways to do it. You can transport food there. You can grow it there.
Yeah.
There's any number of ways to do it.
Wow.
And my suspicion is that if you're going to do something like that, you're going to try and, it would be just like underground bases. You're going to want to give these bases as much self-sufficiency as possible. I mean, my word. The scale of things that the Nazis built.
Oh, yeah.
When the Soviet bloc collapsed in Eastern Europe and researchers had access again to some of the facilities in the former East Germany, scale of these things, they discovered, was enormous.
Oh.
These underground headquarters, for example, they had built a number of headquarters for Hitler and his staff underground in the Eastern Zone. The scale of these things is enormous.
Wow.
They had movie theaters, bowling alleys. I can't see Hitler or anybody in his staff being enthusiasts of bowling, but nonetheless, there they are.
Wow.
Movie theaters, generating facilities. The scale of these things were large. And factories, whole factories underground. So, given the technological capabilities we have today, then magnify that any number of times.
Well, China is currently in the process of building enormous underground cities.
Yes.
What are they expecting?
Well, this is another good question. This is another very good question. There is a school of thought that out there, I don't subscribe to it, but there is a school of thought out there that says that the elites, number one, know something is coming and they're planning for survival, or number two, they're simply creating the illusion of something coming so that they can exercise their centuries-old desire for some sort of global genocide. And I say centuries-old because it really is.
Yeah.
These ideas that the Earth has had too much population, we got to get rid of a lot of it. This is not new by any stretch of the imagination. This is always one of the old themes, arias in the financial opera of the oligarchs. And the only reason that they keep harping on this throughout the centuries is that they know that what they are themselves, that they're a bunch of parasites and crooks.
Yeah.
And they know they're just drastically outnumbered.
Oh, yes.
So it's a way of them securing their own sorry, silly, insane, whats.
Well, wouldn't escaping to Mars and terraforming it?
Well, sure. I mean, that's the old alternative 3 scenario.
Yeah.
And if your listeners have not watched or seen that so-called documentary, I urge you to do so. And to remember that this was done as an April Fool's joke by East Anglia Television in Great Britain.
It's called
Alternative 3. Yeah.
Okay.
You can go on YouTube and watch this thing. It's only an hour long, and it's presented kind of as a British 60 Minutes, science report. All right. It's presented with utmost seriousness. All right. Now, the story is itself worth considering because the two men that put this together, one was a fellow that you see in the actual documentary. He's the elderly English gentleman named David Ambrose. He wears glasses, and he's the main presenter in this so-called documentary. Well, the story is that he and his producer were at lunch one day trying to figure out, what would be a really fun April Fool's joke to play on everybody. So they came up with this idea of Alternative 3, that the elites of the world were busily constructing a secret space program and kidnapping people from all walks and areas of life and expertise and spiriting them away to Mars because they were expecting imminent environmental catastrophe on the Earth, all right? So in other words, it was a big Noah's Ark.
Yeah.
When the show aired in Great Britain, I think it was in the very late 70s, possibly right around the turn of the 1980s. I don't remember the exact year. But when the show aired in Great Britain, much to their surprise, East Anglia Television was inundated with telephone calls and letters by the thousands.
Oh, my.
Because people took it seriously, and not only took it seriously, there were people that reported, yeah, I know all about this.
Oh, my gosh.
I know somebody that's involved with it. so on
Oh my
and so
gosh.
forth. You know, and this just floored the people at East Anglia. But they then produced a book by the name of Alternative 3, which is kind of the storyboard text version of the documentary. The real problem with Alternative 3 is that it, even though it's a joke, GeorgeAnn, it rings so true, it's creepy. You know, you have fake transcripts of an alleged Apollo astronaut. You have all sorts of claims about secret space programs being made in this documentary, of secret missions to Mars much earlier than we were told, and so on and so forth. In other words, the whole thing is creepy because it rings true. And here's the real rub. When the producers of this silly documentary, and there are aspects of it that are just plain silly, all right, but the producers of this documentary, when they published the book, one of them then went on to claim that, after the documentary and after the book came out, I really was followed around by MI6. My phones really were tapped.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, you know, so that only adds fuel to the fire. The whole thing is nutty, and the problem is that when they did this joke, they even put in a German scientist, you know, just for good measure. You know, it's as if they're hitting all the memes that later become part of the actual truth behind the possibility of this secret space program. So in other words, there has always been a school of thought that this wasn't really a joke at all. This was an attempt to let people know what was really going on in the guise of a joke. You know, this is the other interpretation of it. And that really is kind of the interpretation of the old conspiracy researcher Jim Keith, who many of your listeners will probably be familiar with, that died under very, very mysterious, murky circumstances. You know, he went in for knee surgery, outpatient knee surgery, and ended up dead. This was his take on Alternative 3, that there was in fact a kernel of truth to the whole thing.
Wow. Well, Joseph, in the beginning, the Elohim, which is more than one, came...
Actually, it means three or more. That ending means three or more.
Yeah, it's plural.
It's not just plural. It's three or more, because in the Hebrew there is a dual ending, meaning two.
Okay.
All right, it means three or more.
Okay. Three or more came, and evidently they were the primary ones, and they saw to it, they started this project of terraforming this planet. And, you know, you have to wonder, where did they come from? Did they come from Mars? It could be true.
Well, you know, the whole question of terraforming implies, if we grant the proposition for the sake of argument that the Earth was terraformed, that its current environment is, to a certain degree, the product of some artificial engineering, then this would mean that wherever they came from had to have similar environmental aspects to it.
Well, when I've seen pictures of Mars, it looks like the desert of Arizona.
Well, yeah, it does. It does. And interestingly enough, it's very interesting to me that in the color photographs that NASA is now putting up online, you do not see the heavy use of red filters. In other words, you are looking at Mars as it really is,
natural,
with a pale blue atmosphere, with a kind of reddish, sandy brown ground, but in some cases other color.
Yeah.
But you're not looking at the heavily red Mars that those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s are used to.
Why did they do that?
Who knows? Again, I think it was part of an effort to obfuscate data.
Okay.
It was part of an effort to say, well, see, nothing here, folks, just a big barren rock.
Yeah.
You know, move along.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Nothing here.
Oh.
Ignore that face. It's just a trick of light and shadow. Oops, we found another photo with a different sun angle. You know?
Yeah. Oh.
It's just that bad.
Gosh. Oh, gosh, Joseph. Well, if there were people there, mm-hmm. and they came here, mm-hmm. And anything that they would have, quote and quote, created, mm-hmm. would look upon them as gods.
Well, sure, probably. So that's the way that the texts read to me. But the other thing is you've got to remember Arthur C. Clarke's old dictum.
Okay.
Any sufficiently advanced technology
mm-hmm.
will appear to those who do not possess it as magic.
Oh, yeah.
So in other words, the power is ascribed in these texts to the gods. Zeus throwing thunderbolts and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Again, to me, I think that if you're reading texts in this way, if you're granting the possibility that some of these texts, like the Enuma Elish, the fourth tablet of the Enuma Elish,
yes.
which is this horribly detailed description of what to me, for all intents and purposes, looks like the effects of using some sort of quantum potential weapon, or if you prefer, scalar weapon, or a torsion weapon, or whatever you want to call it,
yeah.
to blow up a planet.
Yeah.
It's described in detail that makes physics sense, is what I'm saying. If you grant that, then you're looking at gods that a primitive people would say, oh, they've got magical powers.
Yeah.
Because you don't have any word for what they're doing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Wow.
But they may not really be gods. That's the whole point.
Yes. Yes.
They may pretend to be.
Yeah.
They may demand worship. Gosh, whose claim is that?
Yeah.
And it's a deception. It's a deceit.
Mhm. Yeah, especially when there's so much murder connected with it.
Yes, exactly.
Oh gosh. Well, the Nazis mm-hmm. were very enamored of the far north religions.
Yes.
Thor.
Yes.
And all of that.
Loki, Wotan, Vulcan.
Yes. Yeah. Oh boy.
Well, the reason why is, I assume you're asking or stating that to ask why they were.
Yes.
Well, the reason, in my opinion, that they were enamored of all of this was, number one, and it's the obvious explanation, and that is they were looking ultimately for something that would be sufficiently powerful enough as a cultural symbol to replace Christianity as the main cultural influence within Germany.
Yes.
Make no mistake, while the Nazis were busily executing and exterminating Jews, they had long-range plans for Christians too.
Yes.
These were not a nice group of people.
Yeah.
And that plan, to a certain extent, comes out of the secret societies that help midwife Nazism into existence, and that to that extent, therefore, inform part of its deep core ideology. All right?
Yeah.
But the other reason, I think, that the more hidden reason that the Nazis are looking at that story is that, again, in that mythology, you have the Hyperboreans coming from Ultima Thule, all right, who are basically extraterrestrials that are the ancestral basis of what the Nazis assumed to be the Aryan, white race.
Yeah.
All right. So in other words, for the Nazis, it's all part of that mythology of this ancient, advanced, high civilization that had all of this very advanced stuff. So in other words, this is the second component. This is the other reason that you have Himmler and the SS going all around the world trying to dig things up as evidence for that connection, number one, and probably number two, they were searching for that technology.
Yeah.
Again, if there's the slightest chance that this reading of ancient texts is true, and I think the Nazis were reading some of these texts in precisely that way, if it is even remotely possible that it's true, do you want the Russians, the French, the British, or the Americans to get there first?
Oh.
Of course not.
Yeah.
It becomes, for the Nazis, it becomes a geheime Reichssache. It becomes a secret state matter. It becomes something of the highest importance and therefore the highest classification.
Well, we've got this greed factor going on with banking.
Yes.
And I think that trillions are missing going into black projects. And so Joseph, the physics, the algorithm that they've used to make all this money, and I'm talking about in a global sense, is wearing out. It's coming to an end.
Well, anytime you have debt-based money, anytime you have monetized debt, and people have to understand what monetized debt is. People really don't understand what that means.
Yeah.
That simply means you're circulating a loan note as money.
Yeah.
That's all it means.
A dollar bill is
a loan note.
Yeah.
All right. It's what I called in Babylon's Banksters the facsimile of money, because real money is debt-free, whether that money be a piece of paper, a gold coin issued by some state mint somewhere.
Yeah.
Real money is debt-free. Now, note the way I phrased it, because you have a bunch of people out there that follow a particular school of economics, that, the Austrian school, von Mises, Hayek, and so on, which has a lot of good things to say. I'm not denying it. But my biggest suspicion with that school is this reliance upon what I like to call gold bugs, or even to coin the pun, gold buggery. Because these people want to see a return to the gold standard. Well, here's the bad news, all right? Okay. And I hope to demonstrate this point in a little more detail in a future book. The point now, the problem now is that the economy's size in real dollars, okay, is far bigger than any amount of gold or silver or any other kind of bullion could possibly support, number one. Yeah. And number two, here's the real big problem. It appears to me that most of the gold in the world has been rehypothecated so many times by these banks that no one really knows who owns it. Or to put the same point differently.
Well, explain.
To put the same point differently. Okay. Say you have X amount of ounces of gold. Yeah. And you have used that gold as collateral, say, to float a loan or to float an issue of bonds or what have you.
Yeah.
And then that worked, all right? And then you decide, okay, well, no one's really ever going to call for all this gold. Let's use the same gold to support or float a different loan or different issue of bonds.
Mm-hmm.
And when this proves to be successful, they keep doing it over and over.
Yeah.
So in other words, you've got so many liens now, or so many claims against the same gold.
Oh, yeah.
That it's virtually impossible. In other words, they have committed massive fraud.
Oh, yes. Oh.
And that's the hidden story here. Because there are certain players that did this.
Oh.
They did it for specific reasons.
Joseph.
And they did it to particular people.
Yes.
And those particular people are upset.
Well, my God, they have done this. They've rehypothecated mortgages.
Sure.
Over and over and over and over.
Yeah, the derivatives and the credit default swaps. Yeah, these. Here's what needs to be done. These types of securities are, in my opinion, by dint of the way that they are constructed and composed, they're entirely fraudulent.
Yeah.
They are something that never should have been allowed.
Right.
They were a quick pseudo-money fix for the very wealthy.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
They should never have been allowed. And they should simply be, in my opinion, taken off the books. We are approaching the point where some sort, in my opinion, again, I'm probably going to upset a lot of people. We're approaching the point, in my opinion, where some sort of jubilee is going, and personally, I'll go a step further. Personally, I think there's a certain segment of that community that wants to see that happen because it will be a way for them to reinforce in a subtle fashion the supposed moral superiority of their religious claims.
Yeah, yeah.
That is part of the game.
Yes.
And of course, that moral superiority of those particular religious claims, you only have to read a particular book to find out what a very shallow moral basis those claims are based on.
Yeah. Well, I want to tell everybody, on the 5th of September, I'm going to have a guest, Peter Baxter, and he's going to talk about the Kondratia and
Kondratia cycles, yes.
Yes, and the Jubilee.
Well, Kondratia cycles, I go back to Babylon's banksters.
Yeah.
And, this will be, again, a major theme of the sequel that I just finished a couple weeks ago.
Kondratia?
Not necessarily Kondratia, but simply the idea that the financial oligarchy has known for a long time that there are certain cycles of business.
Yes.
And when you know those cycles, you can plan your financial moves and steps accordingly. You need not look very hard or very far to find out why this is so. Certain commodities are very cyclic in nature. Any agricultural commodity is very cyclic. And war. All of these things. They've known about these things for a long time.
Oh, yes.
The real trick is seeing the connection between your physics cosmology and your financial one. That's more difficult for people to grasp, but it is the crucial key to what's going on here. Once you see what's been done by these oligarchs, I think the jig is kind of up.
Oh yeah. Oh, you mean it's pitchfork time, or how do you mean the jig is up?
Well, the jig is up in the sense that this is not information that can any longer be kept in a bottle.
Yeah.
It's not something. It's an obvious thing that people have written and spoken about for a long time, but the problem has been getting enough people to see it. Now there is a game changer.
Yes.
And the game changer is the Internet.
Oh, yes.
Simply because even publishing a book, word gets around about a book much faster than it has ever done before.
Oh, yeah.
That's
true.
And it can go international immediately. I look at myself, and even though I publish my books in English, I note that almost as soon as they get published, overseas buyers are buying them, simply because the Internet makes that possible.
Yeah.
So, it happens to any author.
Do you know that your page on the Byte Show has been visited well over 1,000 times this month?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
People are looking for new stuff.
Well, people, that's true. This is the other thing that I keep going back to. We're in an age, one of those culturally transforming ages.
Yeah.
And this is the other part of it. People, the rank and file, are increasingly questioning. They're increasingly coming to the position that the reality that they think they live in is a matrix, that their governments have consistently lied to them, that the major media consistently lies, and you have a growing number of people willing to look at numerous sources and make up their minds for themselves.
Right.
This is happening at breathtaking speed. To my mind, I think it's going to take about 10 to 15 years before it approaches a critical mass.
Well, lately they're saying that we're headed for a bloody revolution in this country.
Oh, they've been saying that for years.
Yeah, it's just crazy the stuff that's going on out there.
Oh yeah, I know. There's a lot of fear mongering going on.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of fear mongering going on.
Yeah, that's for sure, Joseph. Well, everybody, buy Joseph P. Farrell's books.
Thank you.
If you can, buy every one of them, because each book has so much information. And read them in order of the way they were written, because there's a very special reason for that. You will be kind of lost in the shuffle if you don't do that. They're written in an order for a special reason. And Joseph, I really compliment you on your writing.
Well, thank you. It's really not necessary, actually, for people to read in order. The books are meant to stand on their own, which they can do. And
I know.
And then, the books themselves point to the connections to other books. The people, they were written in a deliberate order, and that's the best order to read them in. But it's certainly not the only one. But I thank you for that. I do have a web store, so if people want to get the books, they can go to the website, and there's a little bookstore right there on the website. But,
go to
thank you for that.
Giza, Giza, Death, DEATH, star, STAR.com, and use the PayPal button and buy the books. There will be more information in there than, oh my goodness. Joseph, you have started something in the world, and you have. I hear it from people. You really have. Yeah. You have started people thinking, and that's not an easy thing to do.
Well, there's a lot of people out there that I think are helping get the thinking process started.
Yes.
It's necessary. I mean, my word. We live in one of the most brainwashed countries in the world.
Oh,
and it's
yeah.
a country that it's a country that, when the mass media began to appear, changed American culture profoundly.
Yes.
And in my opinion, for the worse.
Yes.
But it's slowly changing back, because you only have to turn on the television and listen to the talking heads on CNN or Fox or whatever to realize just how bad it really is. It reeks.
Another thing, I hope that the people in Ecuador are listening. I congratulate you. I stand behind you for doing what you're doing. My goodness, standing up to the U.S. and the UK the way you have. God bless you. Oh.
Yeah, I'll add an amen to that.
Yes. Well, it takes a lot for a small country to tell a big country that we'll take it to the International Criminal Court.
Yeah, that this is another sign that the financial oligarchs. I get a lot of criticism for writing all the time about, for example, how Russian Today television, RTTV, seems to be doing a much better job journalistically about exposing all of these things than any Western media does. And I get angry comments from people in Eastern Europe, the Ukraine or Russia and so on. Well, you ought to live here, Putin's no angel, he's authoritarian, yada yada. Well, I know he's authoritarian. Duh. Yeah.
Yeah.
My point is, he's not Stalin.
Yeah.
He's a far cry from Stalin. For one thing, Putin is, for whatever reason, he is at least a Russian Orthodox Christian. It might be pure political calculation on his part, and I suspect a lot of it is. But but on the other hand, he's a more, what would be more of a kind of late sort of czarist intellectual oligarch and authoritarian.
With a lot of testosterone.
Yeah, with a lot of that too. And he's an intelligent man. Mm-hmm. This is the other thing. I mean, his degree of intelligence and the way he expresses himself is much, in my opinion, much beyond anything that we see in any other Western leader.
Oh, right.
He's articulate, and look at the sock puppets that we've had occupying the White House for the last couple of decades.
And fixing to occupy.
Well, the problem is that the Western media has increasingly been shown to be the compliant lapdog of the powers that be that it is.
Yeah. And
this Ecuador Assange episode, to my mind, is just another episode in the fact, another illustration of the fact that the Western financial oligarchs have now played this game for so long.
Yeah.
They're playing it now in such a rush and with such brutality and so badly that people are turning against them. And they'd better wake up real fast, because they're losing their power base.
Yeah.
They're losing their power base.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that just with cold-hearted geopolitical calculation.
Yeah.
Even Zbigniew Brzezinski is saying it.
Yeah.
He's saying, slow down, don't be in a rush. They're overplaying their hand, and they're losing not necessarily people that have been traditionally our friends, but at least have been more friendly to us than, quote unquote, the other guy. But they're losing them now.
Yeah.
And Ecuador isn't. I urge people to watch my blogs in the coming weeks particularly this coming week, because Ecuador isn't alone in South America.
Amen.
Argentina has done something very significant.
Yes. Yes.
And I suspect you know what it is too.
Yeah. Oh.
You know, Argentina. You know, it's not surprising that Argentina did what it did, given the past, you know, bad blood between Great Britain and Argentina.
Yeah.
But this is of a different character than things that have gone before.
Are you talking about the ships?
I'm talking about the ships, yeah. Argentina has banned British ships from docking in Buenos Aires.
Yeah.
You know, which is just like saying, we don't want to trade with you people anymore.
Right.
You know.
God bless them.
So, there is something going on here.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. And this, where these types of moves are being made openly, you can bet your bottom dollar that quietly behind the scenes, those Latin American countries have already quietly consulted.
Oh yeah.
With Moscow and Beijing.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
They'll have a much more stable trading partner.
Well, they'll have more stable trading partners that don't go around and foment rebellions in your country.
Yeah.
In the name of democracy and human rights, while they're trying to overthrow quote unquote authoritarian regimes, which have been more or less able to hold countries together, where you have different types of religious population and culture.
Yeah.
And turned the clock back by your meddling with your covert ops, and exacerbated tensions between those cultures that didn't exist under the authoritarian regime you're trying to overthrow.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Oh, Joseph. Oh.
What frightens me is that the Western oligarchs, their playbook is now exposed. And so increasingly they turn to the covert war operations, they turn to
we'll bomb
threats.
You.
This is all they have left.
We'll bomb you into democracy. Gee. Gosh.
It's the militarization of metaphysics. as C. Wright Mills, the famous author of The Power Elite, put it. It's goofiness.
Yeah, it is goofy. Oh, gosh. Oh, Joseph.
And the bad thing is they have been trying this game in Eastern Europe. They've been trying this game in former Soviet republics. They've tried this game in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. They're trying this game because they can't control Putin. And this is what I'm trying to tell my Russian friends that keep saying, well, Putin's an authoritarian. I know he's an authoritarian, folks. But you have to understand who's behind all of the faked opposition to him.
Yeah. That's
what you've got to understand here, my Russian friends.
Yes.
That's what you've got to understand.
Yes.
Putin's not a slouch. He comes from the Komitet Gozvydoshvenoy Veja Poznosti, and I know my Russian friends will know what that means. So, he's got a little analysis up his sleeve, and he knows what's being attempted. And what's being attempted is nothing less than the same covert war game, to stir up opposition and get rid of people who are not playing along with the Western oligarchs. That's exactly what's going on.
At the expense of
thousands of lives.
Yeah.
So, I'm not saying that Mr. Putin or Mr. Hughes Juntao are nice people.
Yeah.
They're politicians. And in my book, if you're a politician, you're probably not nice people. But then you look at the corrupt cesspool and pit of vipers that we have running the West, and then
Whoa.
Yep.
Oh, Joseph, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me back.
Oh, anytime. And everybody, once again, go buy Joseph P. Farrell's books. You've got to get his books. And he's going to have a new one coming out. When's it coming out?
Well, I'm assuming that you mean the transhumanism book with
Yeah.
Dr. DeHart. That should be a couple of months. The book I'm writing now, depending on when I get it done, I'm still in the research phase. I haven't even really started any deep writing. But I'm hoping in the next couple of months to get that done and then off to the publisher. So hopefully around December or January that book should be out too.
Oh, okay.
And at that point I think I'll probably take a 2-week vacation and sleep.
You deserve it. You deserve it.